It's Wednesday, December 11th, 2024. Welcome to this week's Make It Make Sense midweek episode. I'm Granthermes. Today in the show, we are breaking down Trump's first big interview, and I'm sorry that this episode is dropping a little late. The interview is an hour and 15 minutes long, and I had to go back and re-listen to the whole thing to make sure that there wasn't anything that I missed that I wanted to talk about in this episode, and then I had to check that again and double-check my own facts to make sure that we had everything right here. It just took a lot longer than I was expecting. Anyway, I have parsed this down to a few key points. So, Trump went on NBC's morning show, Meet the Press, where he talked to Kristen Welker, the host of the show. What was his first major network sit-down since becoming president-elect? And while it was a really wide-ranging interview, like I said, it was an hour and 15 minutes long, he kept coming back to a few things again and again. It was tariffs, immigration, political retribution, and then I also want to talk about what he said about healthcare. The interview opened with Welker asking Trump about tariffs. Now, Trump ran on the idea of putting really, really high tariffs on mostly Chinese goods that are coming into the U.S. Let's call it for right now the most consistent number he said, which is 200% tariffs. He also said that he wants to put tariffs on imports from other U.S. allies, even like he did with European steel in 2018. But here's what he said, and just for time, because he rambles, I have edited this down a little bit.
Proposing tariffs against the United States' three biggest trading partners. Economists of all stripes say that ultimately consumers pay the price of tariffs.
I don't believe
Can
it.
you guarantee American families won't pay more?
I can't guarantee anything. I can't guarantee tomorrow. I'm a big believer in tariffs. I think tariffs are the most beautiful word. I think they're beautiful. It's going to make us rich. We're subsidizing Canada to the tune of over $100 billion a year. We're subsidizing Mexico for almost $300 billion. We shouldn't be subsidizing. Why are we subsidizing these countries? If we're going to subsidize them, let them become a state. We're subsidizing Mexico.
First, Welker is right there. Economists from all parts of the political spectrum agree that Trump's tariffs will raise prices and costs for the rest of us and will make inflation worse. Something that Trump ran on was reversing and explicitly lowering prices on things that we buy. And here we are just over a month after he won the election with that promise, going back on it already, saying that he can't guarantee that he can even do that, and he's not even the president yet. Second, I want to be very clear about how tariffs work. I don't think that we do enough as journalists of really explaining how tariffs actually work. So tariffs are costs that are forced onto American companies that import goods from other countries. So China, in this case, is not paying those tariffs. American companies are. And that means that those companies will raise prices on goods here at home because it would cost more for them to try to redo their entire supply chain to source things that are just inside the U.S. than it would to just pay the tariffs and then raise the prices for us. Also, not every product or part or material can even be found or made in the U.S. So the idea that we could, what's called repatriatizing, which just means bringing things back into the U.S., that we could do that for all of those things or for everything just isn't real. Now, third, I have no idea what Trump is talking about when he says the U.S. is subsidizing Mexico and Canada. According to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, which is a very real thing, and their only job is to track this exact stuff, the U.S. has a trade deficit with both Mexico and Canada, which means that we're spending more on bringing things in than we are selling things there. Now, with Canada, Trump said there was a $100 billion subsidy happening. Again, no idea, no basis for what he's saying there. The trade deficit, though, is $53.5 billion. With Mexico, it's $131 billion, not $300 billion like he said. So even if you add in the U.S. aid that we give to Canada and Mexico for things like shared wildlife conservation or for humanitarian programs in Mexico for crises that are caused by U.S. immigration policies, in Canada, we only give $32 million in U.S. aid, which to a country the size of the U.S. is nothing at all. And for Mexico, we give about $234 million, just over that really, which isn't even $250 million. In fact, Donald Trump was fined double that for committing fraud in New York this past year. So to say that we are propping up two of our three largest trading partners right now is just factually wrong. And then I have to talk about that little line that he's used several times now when he was talking specifically to Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, but also he's used it in the past, in the recent weeks here, that if we're, quote, subsidizing these countries, let them become a state. That has not gone over well in Canada or in Mexico, not to mention in places like Puerto Rico, which has been trying to become a state for decades now, along with Washington, D.C., which has also been looking for statehood for decades now. But it really set off alarm bells with the international community because this is a guy in Donald Trump who was cozy with people like Vladimir Putin, who was actively engaged in a war trying to take back the country of Ukraine to make it part of what used to be the Soviet Union again. And so for Trump to say something like, let's make another sovereign nation a state, it raises worries of something like a U.S. invasion of Canada or Mexico for the purpose of conquering those places to create new states for the United States, which I don't really think is what Trump is saying here. I think he's just being hyperbolic to make a point. But also, this is a guy that we have to take literally when he says things because he's going to be the president. Trump was also asked about whether he'd punish CEOs of companies who raise their prices because of tariffs, which, like I said, they're going to be raising prices because that's how tariffs work. But this was his answer.
Jobs.
But how do you make sure that consumers don't wind up paying more? Will you punish CEOs who try to pass the cost of tariffs onto their customers?
Well, the market's going to take care of it. I mean, actually, the market takes care of it. And if it doesn't, we adjust it somewhat. But in the case of Whirlpool, or let's say companies that made washing machines, they were all being put out of business by the dumping from, in particular, South Korea and China. And when I put the tariffs on, very substantial tariffs, although peanuts compared to what people do to us, what countries do to us, it became a very, very powerful, successful company. Now, let's say I didn't do the tariffs. It would have gone out of business. You would have lost tens of thousands of jobs, and you don't include that in your equation. No, they make a lot of money. I'll go a step further. Tariffs are going to make our country rich.
So his answer here, Trump is a business dude. The idea that the market will take care of it is always going to be his answer. The reality that we know exists is that the market won't take care of it. What he means by that is that if prices go up, people will just stop buying the more expensive things and opt for the companies that sell the cheaper things. But that's not how companies or consumers operate. And we know that because we just saw it during his previous presidency and more specifically during the pandemic, where there were CEOs who were caught on recorded shareholder calls and in court transcripts saying they were raising prices because they knew the, quote, market would bear it. And this is something that I've talked about before, but we know that when companies raise prices, people just still pay them, especially when they're on things like paper towels, which the price for those will be going up because if we put tariffs on Canada, we get a lot of wood and paper products from Canada, or things like chicken, or even, like I said, lumber and steel to make cars. Now, that story that he tells about Whirlpool in Ohio, that is true. Trump put tariffs on LG and Samsung, South Korean companies that were building and selling cheaper washers and dryers and outselling Whirlpool here in the U.S. Now, the problem is that the price for all washers and dryers across the board soared, prices jumping 35% according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and that bled into all appliances from any company where the cost rose by 23%, and it spiked the cost for everything else. not just appliances, but all goods and services across the country by 20%. And that was just tariffs on 2 countries. And we're still feeling those price increases today. Washers and dryers are still 15% more expensive than they were before 2018 when Trump put those tariffs in place. And yes, some of those price increases are from the Biden administration's increase in inflation that we saw over the past few years from the pandemic economy. But the fact remains that those prices wouldn't have been nearly as high had Trump not put those tariffs in place in 2018. But let's move on here because Trump talked a lot about immigration. A lot of it was the usual lies and exaggerations about people being sent here from jails, prisons, and asylums, which there's never been any factual basis for or any real piece of evidence that he has presented or that anyone has been able to find. He said that crime rates were up in American cities, which they aren't right now because of undocumented immigrants, which also isn't true. Something that Welker actually corrected him on. She pointed out and said that just 3% of undocumented immigrants living in the U.S. right now have some kind of criminal record. But the thing that I want to focus on here is what Trump said about ending birthright citizenship.
Your other promises on this topic. You've promised to end birthright citizenship on day one. Is that still your plan?
Yeah, absolutely.
The 14th Amendment, though, says that, quote, all persons born in the United States are citizens. Can you get around the 14th Amendment with an executive action?
We're going to have to get a change. We'll maybe have to go back to the people, but we have to end it. We're the only country that has it.
Through an executive action?
We're the only country that has it. Do you know, if somebody sets a foot, just a foot, 1 foot, you don't need to, on our land, congratulations, you are now a citizen of the United States of America. Yes, we're going to end that because it's ridiculous.
Through executive action?
Well, if we can, through executive action.
So it's still really unclear how he would go about ending the right to be a citizen if you're born on U.S. soil without a constitutional amendment that would need 2/3 of all of Congress to change that, plus 3/4 of all the states to approve it as well. Now, there are probably some things that he could do that would slow down the process for naturalization, but he's never laid out a plan for that part of things. But to understand this thing, too, I want to talk a little bit about birthright citizenship. So it comes from the 14th Amendment, which was the amendment that was born out of freeing slaves after the Civil War. And it was created because when Lincoln freed the slaves, they were no longer legally property, they were people. I mean, they were always people, but you get what I'm saying here. Well, the U.S. government had to decide whether those people were considered Americans, because by 1850, a full 16 years before the 14th Amendment was signed, a majority of enslaved people in the U.S. were 3rd, 4th, or even 5th generation people who had been born on U.S. soil into slavery. And when it was signed, as one historian who looked at birthright citizenship said it, no people born in the United States, Americans decided, should be forced to live in the shadows. Now, there was opposition to birthright citizenship from traitorous white supremacist Southerners and Southern sympathizers in the North, like one Pennsylvania senator who said that birthright citizenship would lead to an America that was, quote, overrun by another and a different race. And boy, doesn't that sound like the thing that we have been hearing from Trump and his allies about immigrants? Now, Trump is also wrong when he says that the U.S. is the only country with birthright citizenship. Some 65 countries have some version of birthright citizenship. 33 of them have a extremely similar unrestricted birthright citizenship like the U.S. does. And there is no version of becoming a U.S. citizen where you just step onto U.S. soil and poof, you're an American. The process to become an American citizen is a years-long process that starts with first having to be a permanent resident for at least 5 years, or 3 if you're married to a U.S. citizen. But becoming a permanent resident is hard and could often take years, sometimes up to a decade. And then, after having been here long enough, you have to apply and go through a rigorous interview and application process. That can take up to 2 years, and then you have to take classes about American laws and the government and civics, and then you have to take a test and pass that test. And it's not an easy test either, because in 2018, The Center for Citizens and Scholars at Princeton found that just 1 in 3 U.S.-born Americans could even pass that test. And if you want to know more about Trump's immigration plans, go back and listen to yesterday's bonus episode. It's the one right before this in your queues. I go into a lot more detail about immigration and mass deportations and who's pulling the strings there. But let's move on to what Trump said about healthcare. He did not talk about the assassination of the United Health CEO or Luigi Mangione, though I will be tomorrow on the Make It Make Sense Substack, so subscribe for that. What he did talk about, though, was still not having a plan for healthcare. Take a listen.
You said during the campaign you had concepts of a plan. Do you have an actual plan at this point for healthcare?
Yes, we have concepts of a plan that would be better.
Still just concepts? Do you have a fully developed plan?
Let me explain. We have the biggest healthcare companies looking at it. We have doctors. We're always looking because Obamacare stinks. It's lousy. There are better answers. If we come up with a better answer, I would present that answer to Democrats and to everybody else, and I do something about it. But until we have that, or until they can approve it, but we're not going to go through the big deal.
So we are back to the concepts of a plan. Republicans, including Trump, have tried to kill the Affordable Care Act, which is Obamacare. They're the same thing. 100 times since 2010. There's literally a whole website dedicated to it called How Many Times the House Voted to Repeal Obamacare.com. And none of those attempts have been successful, partly because the Affordable Care Act is popular. Millions of people have at least some version of health care that they didn't have before 2010. And I think that we can all agree that it's a good thing that people can go see a doctor when they are hurt or sick. But Trump is wrong that the health care under the Affordable Care Act is lousy. The Government Accountability Office, or the GAO, just found last week in a study that when you look at premiums for people who get their health insurance through their employer versus people who get it through the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, while the premiums on their faces are higher for people who are on the Affordable Care Act, when you factor in things like tax credits for using Obamacare, premiums are actually more expensive. The cost for health insurance is actually more expensive per person if you get your health care through an employer. And in that same study, the GAO found that because healthcare and insurance companies have been allowed to consolidate in so many states, 33 states across the country, right now, the cost of private health insurance is going up and will be increasing next year. And to have these private companies, as Trump said, looking into alternatives to Obamacare, why would they have any incentive to do anything other than they're doing right now, or to make that system better when they're making money hand over fist? But at any rate, the takeaway here is that Trump still, despite being in American politics for a decade now, doesn't have a plan for a signature piece and a signature promise of what was his previous campaign, his presidency, his last campaign, and now his future presidency. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is what he said when he was asked if he would direct his Department of Justice or the FBI to go after political opponents, particularly the people who were on the January 6th committee that investigated the insurrection. And for full transparency, if you're just listening to this, these are two clips that are played back to back. He's not saying this as a full single sentence.
You named Kash Patel to be the next FBI director. Yeah. He has a list in his book of 60 people that he calls members of the so-called deep state. It includes Democrats like Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton. It includes former members of your cabinet, from Bill Barr to Christopher Wray. You campaigned on destroying the deep state. Do you want Kash Patel to launch investigations into people on that list?
No, I mean, he's going to do what he thinks is right.
Do you think that's right? Do you think that's right, sir?
If they think that somebody was dishonest or crooked or a corrupt politician, I think he probably has an obligation to do it. I think those people committed a major crime.
Sir?
And Cheney was behind it. Well, and so was Benny Thompson and everybody on that committee. For what they did, honestly, they should go to jail.
So you think Liz Cheney should go to jail?
for what they did.
Everyone on the committee, you think?
I think everybody anybody that voted in favor.
Are you going to direct your FBI director and your attorney general to send them to jail?
No, not at all. I think that they'll have to look at that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to focus on drill, baby, drill.
When you say that, it carries weight, though. You've tapped these people to lead the Justice Department and FBI.
They can do whatever they want.
So this is how Trump talks, in sort of these mob boss terms. Like, I would never tell them to do anything, but, do what's right. It's implied direction. And this is who Trump told us he would be, but this is dictator stuff. Go back and listen to my episode about whether Trump fits the definition of fascism or not. This is winking and nodding to federal law enforcement that people who differ with Trump politically deserve to be punished for it, and he's giving them permission to do, he said it, whatever they want. And under people like Kash Patel, Trump's pick to lead the FBI, has said that he wants to do things like go after journalists, media outlets, government employees, former Trump opponents like Hillary Clinton. That would likely mean, in some version, suspending civil rights and the First Amendment. It means that the FBI and the DOJ will be used in ways that we haven't seen since the days of J. Edgar Hoover in the mid-1900s, and likely in ways that we have never seen before. And to me, this is the most troubling part of this interview, that Trump, now unconstrained by another election or adults in the room like he had in his first administration, is telling us exactly who he'll be during this administration. Okay, that is it for today's midweek episode. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you listen to this on. Like and subscribe, and hit that bell for notification on YouTube so you don't miss out on any of these episodes or the full episodes, or I guess whenever I put up bonus episodes. That's a thing I'll be doing now. Also, continue to share the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod. It's all one word on every platform. Don't forget to subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack either, where I've got bonus content there and more writing about just the things that are happening on the day-to-day basis. And I'm still, for those of you waiting for it, slowly getting up the cabinet pick breakdown. There are a lot of names to sort through, and they've got a lot of things to talk about. And finally, please follow me on social media as well. I am at Granthermes on Twitter or X or whatever. Also on Bluesky, you can find me there now. And I am at Granthermes TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Granthermes, and I'll talk to you on Friday.